Consider this a voice crying out in the wilderness. When we talk about Iran, we actually use two names, Iran and Persia, and they can be a bit confusing. Iran comes from an ancient root. You know that ancient root, Arya? It means the land of the Aryans, which really translates to the land of the nobles. Interestingly, there is a trace of the same root in Greek when we talk about aristos, aristocracy. It's built on that same foundation. This tells us that from the most ancient times, the Persian people have held themselves in high regard. And as you'll see, they have good reason to, given their extraordinary history spanning millennia. The word Persia, on the other hand, which gives us Farsi, you've probably heard of Farsi, right? When we think of Farsi speakers, Freddie Mercury might come to mind, but we're talking about the same people. Persia is actually the Greek name for this land. Iran has an incredibly ancient history. This civilization has been around since truly remote times. I can't give you the full history of the Persian people. That's not my intention here. But I want to highlight certain characters and events that connect directly to us in the West. First of all, let's not forget that what we now call Iran, or the Persian Empire, was the ultimate frontier of the Roman Empire. Rome never managed to penetrate and truly defeat the Parthians. That's what the Romans called the Persians at that time. They simply couldn't do it. So the Roman Empire's eastern boundary was Persia itself. This already creates an interesting dynamic of the other. When we speak of the Persians, we are talking about where the real Asia begins. The Asia not influenced by the West, the beginning of a world that didn't experience many of the forces that would later shape not only what we consider the West today, but also the Middle East and North Africa. Persia has this allure of being fundamentally different from us since the most ancient times. Among the peoples who considered Persia as other were the Jews, and they did so long before the Romans. Remember, there's a period in the history of Israel called the Babylonian Captivity. The Jews experienced several captivities. One was the Babylonian Captivity, when the ruling class was, let's say, taken, I'm simplifying here, and brought to Babylon, which was then part of the Persian Empire. And here, something truly remarkable and unique happened. How did the Jews escape the Babylonian captivity? And by whose grace? By the grace of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus II, around 539 BC, was a magnificent ruler who had proclaimed himself son of Marduk. But here's the fascinating part, and this might challenge some of our assumptions. Cyrus II is the only foreign ruler in the entire history of Israel's relations with other peoples to be called Mashiach, that is, Messiah. Think about that. The gratitude, the respect, the sense of honor that the people of Israel felt towards Cyrus the Great was so profound that they gave him the title reserved for the kings of Israel, the title of the Lord's Anointed. We could say, in a certain sense, taking the word literally, that Cyrus the Great was a Messiah, and we wouldn't be wrong if we understood Messiah simply as a translation of Mashiach. Now pay attention here. Mashiach, the Lord's Anointed, the title for the King of Israel in the early part of Jewish history, gets translated into Greek as Christos, the Christ. Christos means the Anointed One, from the verb to anoint. So when we say Christ, we're saying the Anointed One. But to understand what this really means, we need to look at the history of the people of Israel and their relationship with Persia. This shows us that, at least in the early phase of Israel's history, the word Messiah, or Christ in Greek, simply meant the Lord's Anointed, a king who was a savior of his people. There wasn't yet the full awareness of what would come later with the book of Daniel. And it's no coincidence that it's precisely the book of Daniel where things shift. I won't go into excessive theological speculation here, but from the book of Daniel onward, the concept evolves. Yet, right there in Persia, we have attestation of the fact that Jews could call someone Christ, someone Messiah, who was not himself Jewish. It only happened once, but it happened. Let's take that as a fascinating piece of the puzzle. But our connections with Persia don't stop there. There's so much more to explore in our intertwined histories. You probably know that in Persia there was an ancient religion, and it still exists in residual form today, called Zoroastrianism, the religion of Zarathustra. Remember Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra? Nietzsche was digging into some of these very ideas I'm touching on here. This religion is based on a powerful dualism. I'll keep it simple. Between a deity of good, a creator god, and an evil deity. Ahura Mazda is the creator god, and Ahriman is the evil one. You can see there's a circularity of good and evil in this dualism that later passed into the West through what we call Manichaeism. This idea of opposing forces of good and evil. It would be fascinating to explore how much Zoroastrian religion actually reached us through various intermediary traditions. This distant Orient has influenced us far more than we realize. But here's where I want to focus. There was this religion, and because of the relationship its practitioners had with the elements, particularly with fire, the priests, the celebrants of this religion, became associated with magic. They were considered magicians. The priests of Persian Zoroastrianism were called Magi. And who are the ones who, by reading the stars, went searching for the new Messiah? The Magi. We call them the three wise men, or the three kings today. The idea that they were kings is a much later tradition. Let's not get too deep into that. But what we know from the Gospel accounts, the historical source closest to the events, is that there was a caravan, perhaps with merchants among them, who knows, that included these priests of this ancient cult. These priests belonged to a tradition that had intertwined significantly with the people of Israel, and that certainly influenced Jewish religion during the Babylonian Captivity. There are wonderful studies showing that when the Jewish ruling class was deported, the common people, the farmers, the rural folk, remained in the territory of the Kingdom of Israel. Those who stayed home maintained ancient traditions, while those who returned from Babylonian captivity came back with different traditions. There was conflict between them. These are fascinating studies. So Persia directly influenced the Jewish people, and therefore directly influenced some of the deepest aspects of Western civilization. Now, the Magi, these priests, arrive and recognize the new Christ. We could say that the Persians were perhaps the first, along with the shepherds, but the first with conscious understanding to recognize the Christ. They recognized in Jesus the messianic figure the Jews had awaited for centuries, the Son of God, the Son of Man. Have you ever thought about this? The first to recognize the divinity of Jesus, the first to bring those three gifts that, as you know, represent kingship and divinity, they were the Magi from the east. And what lies east of Israel? Persia. So you see, this place that seems so distant is actually integral to the foundational roots of our Western and Christian identity. I've mentioned Zoroastrianism, this ancient cult that remained dominant or at least widely practiced in Persian territories until the arrival of Islam, which, well, swept away most of what was there. But Persia was also a deeply Christian territory. Deeply Christian. We know for certain that there was a powerful, significant spread of Christianity there. Tradition says the Apostle Thomas went there, and that Christianity became the mediator for evangelization to other nations, particularly India and China. We know this with some certainty because at a certain point in history, in the early centuries, a Christian vision emerged in Persia that would later be condemned as heresy by the Council of Ephesus and then the Council of Chalcedon. This heresy was called Nestorianism. It's actually quite interesting. In the debate going on in the Christian world about the natures of Christ, Nestorius, a bishop, advanced the idea that there were two distinct natures, divine and human, and that in some variants, the divine nature came later. So Jesus wasn't born fully divine, meaning the Magi, in this view, would have recognized the one who would become the Messiah. This idea led to conflict with the rest of Christianity, particularly with the Monophysites, who held the extreme opposite view, that Jesus had only one nature, the divine. But note that the Nestorian idea is quite interesting, because within that Trinitarian debate, it offers a version that, even though it was excommunicated, isn't entirely incompatible with faith. So much so that churches descended from Nestorianism still exist today. The Assyrian churches, the churches of the East, where there is great faith. These churches didn't accept the Council of Chalcedon. They're called pre-Chalcedonian by those who study these matters. And here's what's truly fascinating. This Nestorian idea serves somewhat as a bridge, if you will, between Christianity and Islam. Muhammad almost certainly knew Nestorians. According to early church fathers, he might have known an Arian monk. But based on the doctrines we find in the Quran, it seems more likely he knew Nestorians. And this makes sense, because Nestorianism was widespread. In fact, Christianity was very widespread in Arabia, where Muhammad was born and raised. Think about it. In Islam, Jesus is not called the Son of God. The divine attribution is missing. All the Christic recognition is absent. This could be the next step in a dialogue with Nestorians who said Jesus was born human and then became divine. Muhammad, speaking with these Nestorians, may have concluded that Jesus never became divine at all. Hence, he doesn't recognize Jesus' divinity. But certainly there was dialogue between these two worlds. The Persian church, even before it became Nestorian, had its martyrs and confessors. It had, as I mentioned, significant evangelization reaching all the way to the Far East. It had its own tradition that was later profoundly compressed, first by the rise of Nestorianism and its internal conflicts, but most of all by the advent of Islam. When Islam arrived, all of this came to an end. We know Islam imposed itself militarily and through coercive legal mechanisms. The space for this Christian tradition shrunk dramatically and survived mainly in other places like India and China, where many Nestorians remained until relatively recent times, until medieval emperors decided Christianity could no longer exist. So you see, this Orient, this Persia that seems so distant, for the Jews, it was Persia that, after capturing them, allowed them to build the Second Temple, the very temple where Jesus was born, lived, and preached among the Jews of the Second Temple period. For Christians, Persia is a central junction, both for the deep roots the Zoroastrian Persian world gave to Judaism and therefore to Christianity, for this connection symbolized by the presence of the Magi, and for the development during the Nestorian era. So when we talk about Persia, yes, we're talking about this revolution, about the Islamic regime and the dictators. But we're also talking about a people with a history spanning many millennia, a history intertwined with ours far more than we imagine, a history that each of us would do well to understand better. So let this be a prompt for all of us to explore the connections between the Persian people and the West. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and God bless you all.